Bible sales in 2025 were nearly double what they were in 2019. The research tells us that Gen Z are spiritually curious and buying Bibles. One of the most common objections to the Bible is that it's outdated and sexist. What are we to make of stories of violence against women in the Old Testament? And some of Paul's New Testament letters seem to put men in power over women. Those passages have been used to control and oppress women for centuries. The Bible is an ancient text written thousands of years ago in cultures very different from our own, but Christians around the world see these scriptures as sacred and the primary way to understand God's character and intentions for humanity. If we're to learn from these challenging texts and equip these spiritually seeking young people who are now reading the Bible, we need to address and unpack these passages with honesty, authenticity, and good theology. In many churches, these passages are skipped over. The Sunday lectionary doesn't include them, so we can avoid preaching on them. But how can we address these passages? Teaching the skills to understand the cultural context and how we understand these passages in the light of Jesus' teachings. I'm Melanie Cave, Managing Director at Roots, and today I'm speaking with Bekah Legg. Bekah founded Restored UK, a Christian charity supporting survivors of domestic abuse. Bekah also has a background in theology, particularly focusing on these tricky passages of Scripture. A content warning. This conversation covers violence against women and domestic abuse and may not be suitable for younger listeners. Survivors, you might alternatively want to access the transcript or read Bekah's article on the Roots website if it's too hard to listen. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Welcome, Bekah, to the Roots for Churches podcast. Great to have you today.
It is really lovely to be with you.
Thank you. So before we get into the sort of nitty-gritty of women in the Bible, can you give us a bit of your personal story? Like, how did you become a Christian? You've gone to theological college. What made you interested in studying theology?
So this is a long story, isn't it? Because I'm quite old now, and I'll put it into a little short one. So essentially, I grew up in a Christian family and have this lovely memory of sitting on the floor with my parents as a probably about a 4 or 5 year old and wanting to become friends with Jesus, which probably became a lot more solidified as in my teens and as I grew up. And the truth is, I always did love understanding the Bible and studying it. I grew up in the Brethren Church, actually, which was really Bible focused. And, I grew up knowing the Bible stories, understanding them. And I think I always would have liked to go to Bible college, but it wasn't really what girls did in my church. So I didn't. And I went off and I studied history, which was probably quite similar in some ways, and became a teacher and followed a whole other path initially. But I ended up going to college and doing my master's in theology. Was it 10 years ago now? Because I was beginning to do quite a lot in church. I'd been leading youth group for ages. I was preaching, and I really felt like I wanted to have that solid grounding and that sense of, I'm saying all these things, I am doing all the reading and the prep, but I would feel better if somebody had at least given me a tick to go, she's all right at this. It would help. So a little while ago I went back to Moorlands Bible College and did my master's in theology there.
And I think you picked quite an interesting topic for your dissertation. Will you give us a bit of insight into that?
Well, yeah, I really did. So I chose to look at the story of the Levite and his concubine, which is possibly one of the most nasty stories in the Bible, and to focus on that. And because I was doing a specialism in preaching, so my title was, How Do You Preach on Judges 19 in an Age of Me Too? How do we tackle a story like that in a world where we've become so much more aware of violence against women? What does that look like? And I chose it because the truth is that's as part of a longer story, that's something I'm really interested in. But also, honestly, because everything was so crazy that I nearly didn't do a dissertation. I nearly finished my course and just didn't get the master's part of it. And my tutor said, Bekah, it'd be so worthwhile you just having a go. What are you really interested in? He said, because if you're interested in it, you'll find it much easier. And so that was it. That's why I chose it.
And to be fair, Judges 19 is not a passage many preachers would choose. It's not in the lectionary. I think the lectionary compilers maybe helped us all dodge a bullet in one level, because it's a very gruesome story. This woman is a concubine. There's some sort of inequality there. And then the story goes that she is gang raped. Mm-hmm. And then does he kill her or does she die as a result of that?
Frankly, it's not terribly clear. We know that her body is left on the doorstep and he picks it up and he takes it home and he cuts it up into 12 pieces. Quite at which point she dies isn't made utterly obvious. So, but it's gruesome either way.
Yeah. And then he sends her body parts to the 12 tribes of Israel saying, look how depraved, how fallen we are. What are you going to do about it? And then they come back and have a violent uprising.
Yeah, they don't get wild in retribution. It's not a great story all round, really.
No. So, I mean, I suppose one of the things that we need to talk about is that not all Bible stories are instructive, like, and this is how you should live, children. Or you pick it up and you preach and like, what a great example to follow. There's nothing in that story that you want to emulate, really. So what are we to make of? And there are many more stories, particularly in the Old Testament, where women are treated really, really badly. And there's no comment of correction in the passage that says this is really out of order. Now, I'm aware that it's an ancient text and we don't want to put our modern sensibilities onto an ancient text. But for a lot of people, this is a big stumbling block to becoming a Christian, to following Jesus, is how can you be people of this book? How can you follow the Bible when it has all these horrible stories in it and that women particularly are treated really badly? So give us a bit of some of your masters. How do you tackle this? How do we wade into this?
It's a hard one. And I think, and the reality is that there are times when stories like this have been used as instructional text. People have decided to do that. There's something very interesting in the Judges 19 story in particular. It's in verse 2. I promise I'm not going to take it verse by verse. We're not going to go through it all. But in verse 2, some translations of the Bible start the story by saying that this woman, this concubine, left her husband because she was angry with him. And then the story continues and she goes to her father's house and then her husband comes to win her heart back. And then they travel home, but they don't get there. And then they stop at the stranger's house and the story continues and then she ends up dead. Right. So, but she's angry with him. And fundamentally, that almost sets the story up as this woman who has been wronged by her husband from start to finish, because it's so unusual for a woman to leave her husband. He must have done something terrible, because if we can put ourselves back in that culture, culturally, it was utterly unacceptable for a woman to leave. So something significant happened. But other translations of the Bible say that she was unfaithful. And another translation says that she was a whore. Now, those are really different starts to the story. And two of them, like the unfaithful one, it could be as simple as the fact that she left was unfaithful. That's all that needs to mean. But the whore one there's no getting around that. But actually that only happened in the Middle Ages, that the translation got turned into whore, prostitute, whatever word you want to use. But the King James does say whore. And it was by a Middle Ages theologian. And what I would argue is that was a story that got fundamentally changed from a woman who was angered by her husband to a woman who brought it all on herself because of her behaviour. So suddenly they victim blamed this woman for all that's happened, which isn't the original. And as I spent pages talking about that in my dissertation, fundamentally they victim blame her. And it's a way of controlling women. It's a way of saying, if you behave like that, if you follow her footsteps, she becomes a cautionary tale. This is what happens to bad girls who don't know how to behave. Good girls who do their husband's bidding are safe and they stay safe and they are protected, and girls who don't, well, this is what happens at the end. And so actually sometimes stories like this have been twisted and taken and used to control women, but it isn't the original and it's not what's there. And I think it's so important to remember that actually at no point in this story does God go, and this is what you must do, you must now take this woman and gang rape her. That's not what happens. This is a telling of the real world, and the telling of a story that, quite frankly, it's very easy to write off as, oh, weren't they barbaric all those years ago? Or, in some other parts of the world, don't they treat their women terribly? But we have to stop and remember that actually this nameless woman 3,000 years ago on the other side of the world represents an awful lot of nameless women in our world, in our country, in our town, maybe even on our street or in our church, who have been hurt by men who are meant to love them. And so actually this is a story from a long time ago, but it's a story that represents things that happen now. And if God felt it was worth getting that in the Bible 3,000 years ago and recording it, then that means he cares about what's going on now. So that's a really important thing. And there are other stories of other rapes in the Old Testament that are horrible and rarely preached on, unless someone's invited me, usually. And they're rarely preached on, they're rarely looked at. And I don't think that's a good thing, because there are, there are a number of them. And what they say is God sees these things happen behind closed doors and we hush them up. And here's the thing, we don't put them in our lectionary and we don't talk about them and we keep them hidden. God says, no, I see those. I see it. I know and I care. And I think that as hard as these stories are to hear, and they can be really hard for someone who is a victim or a survivor of abuse, actually to know that God doesn't look away. God knows. God cares. God doesn't pretend it hasn't happened. He acknowledges it. He doesn't say my reputation's too good for this. You know, we're going to hush that one up. He lets the truth be spoken. I think that's the reason they're there, because they happen and God sees.
Yeah, and the whole context of the book of Judges is basically the people of Israel not following God. Like, they go their own ways. They follow all the other gods of the other nations. They're not following God's rules for society or for a living. And the point of the book is, look how bad it's got.
Yeah.
Well, if there is a moral to all of Judges, this is what happens when society is totally not following God.
Yeah.
That relationships break down and people are violent and the vulnerable get really hurt and die. And so this is why we do need to live according to God's laws, God's rules. Now, the challenge with that is that some of those rules that we read, like in Moses's laws, also don't sound like they're that great for women. So they might have been progressive at the time, but when we read them, we're like, well, it sounds like women are property, or it sounds like women are not listened to. Why is God not standing up more for the women? Why did he not, when he's giving Moses the laws, make it far more egalitarian? And, that's a hard question to answer, Bekah.
I think that one of the things you have to do going back is always hold things in their cultural context as well, and understand actually God's basic laws, the 10 Commandments, haven't got anything that's negative about women. They just are what they are. And then all these other bits get added on and tagged on. And over the years, some really grim stuff gets tagged on that, Jesus pointedly calls back out and says, no, we're not doing that. But the other thing that's really important to look at as you go back is to look at how different Israel, God's people's rules were to the world around them. And there's a theologian called William Webb, and he's written a book that talks about something that he calls the redemptive direction of travel. And he says, when you look at, so the fact that we have slaves at all in the Old Testament and that there are laws about slaves, which makes you go, oh gosh, does God think slavery is good? You go, well, actually, if you look at how slaves were treated in the rest of the world and then how slaves were treated in Israel, well, actually, they could only be kept, they had to be released after so long. And they were only ever slaves because they were paying off a debt. They weren't just, taken off, plundered and captured and forced into, work in mines and things. Like it was a very different thing, but also there was this idea of there's meant to be freedom, and there's meant to be, and as you go through the Bible, you see that redemptive movement getting further and further away from culture and becoming better, and you see God's original intention coming into play. And I would argue that you see the same thing with women as well. How women are treated, how women are looked after is wildly different to how women were treated in the cultures around, which were fundamentally disgusting. It is so much better within the kingdom of God. And so there's so much that if you read it at face value looks one way, but when you understand it put against the culture of the time it looks positively revolutionary. And we see it generally getting better and better and better. And then by the time Jesus comes along, you look at how he treated women, which was 100% different. And then you start seeing that redemptive movement keep on moving up. So that always helps me to look at it in that respect. But there's still passages that you just go, I just don't get it. I don't get it. I always talk about having a list of questions for God when I get to heaven, and it's quite long.
I think we'd all like to earwig into that conversation. It sounds like it would be meaty. So let's come back to this idea of God's original intention. Because there's quite a lot of good stuff. I mean, Eve gets blamed for a lot of things, but there's a lot of good stuff in the sort of Garden of Eden narrative. There's a lot of equality. They're co-heirs. They both bear the image of God. But what else do we want to say about God's original intention that then helps us interpret the stuff that comes later, which, as we've said, is violent and sometimes very culturally shaped?
I think that when you see these, Adam and Eve, whether, and whatever our religious understanding of this, some of us have got a very literal, it was a man called Adam and a woman called Eve, and some of us see them as metaphorical representations. And fundamentally at this point, it doesn't matter which of those you think, God created men and women. He made them equally to work together, to do that in partnership, to enjoy this land together, to enjoy each other together, to enjoy companionship with God together. That was the original intention, was to be together, to enjoy one another's company, to live in community, to cheer one another on. Like, that's everything that's there. Both made in God's image, both made equal, both given the same roles. And then everything went wrong. Everything went wrong when Adam and Eve, frankly, together chose not to trust that God had their best interests at heart, and they chose to make other decisions their own way. So but fundamentally, in the beginning, was good. It was very good.
And so then after that, things start going wrong and we get more and more oppression. Which Bible passages have caused the most grief for women in terms of the way that they're interpreted? And where did that kind of interpretation of scripture come from?
Well, I guess I'm going to say a number of things here, actually. I guess you almost have to go back to Genesis, because after the fall, when God comes and finds Adam and Eve and says, "Where are you?" which of course he knows where they are. He's giving them a chance to come back to him. And we have what is sometimes called the curse. And God says to Eve, having offspring is going to be difficult. And one of the things he says is, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And here's the thing. That, I would argue, is not a curse. It is God just going, things are broken now. This is what it's going to end up being like. It's not God going, and this is your punishment, and this is how it must be forevermore. It's God saying, here's a consequence. Like this is what you've kicked off. This sucks. But actually, right from that moment, that is what has gone wrong. Like this, he will rule over you. Your desire will be for him. And you're going to have a power battle from here on in. And almost from that moment, you've got this power imbalance where actually men's desire, and frankly, women's desire too, for domination, for control, for power, to be better than, to be more successful than, kicks off right there. And that first structure that is recognized is the difference between the sexes. And of course, we've got a gazillion other structures around originally tribe and nationality and ethnicity and class and ability and the color of your hair and whatever else, your education, whatever else we create to give ourselves power over one another, that's in there right from the very beginning. And that's, again, like that's not a God ordained thing. That's just a speaking out of the truth. And then we get through to passages that have a little bit like Judges 19 in the Middle Ages being taken and weaponized to literally control women. We do see some of those. So my day job is working for an organization called Restored, and we support survivors of domestic abuse, but very specifically Christian women. And so often their story is one of not just being let down and hurt and harmed by somebody who was meant to love them, but of part of that story being either that certain scriptures were like flat out weaponized against them, or where actually they've grown up with an understanding that makes them feel trapped. An understanding of the Bible, an understanding of their faith that makes them feel trapped. And there are certain verses and certain passages that definitely can get misused and twisted. Now, I don't think that's what they're there for, but they're very easy to manipulate if we're not careful. That was a long way of even getting to the answer. I'm so sorry, Melody.
It's good. No, I love it. So, yeah, because that makes sense to me. Like sometimes the way that we do marriage, the way that we do relationships, it's kind of like the air we breathe. If we're fish, it's the water we swim in. It's cultural. It could be theological, but often it's not even been explicitly taught. I grew up, in church in the 80s. I feel like it was taught a bit more. There was a lot more debate then about complementarianism and egalitarianism and headship. Those were passages that got preached in the church I grew up in. And they were contentious. And there was a whole thing of like, this is what it means to understand the Bible. This is what it means to be a good Christian wife, or this is what a good Christian man should do to lead his family spiritually. And if people are loving God and are genuinely caring and putting others first, and they have that theology, it probably would work out fine. But it's when you've got that theology, or maybe just the hint of it, that sort of permissions some male behavior that is really controlling and violent and oppressive. It's often a little piece of theology that people pick up, or they've even just sort of heard and not even been to church, but they sort of think, oh, the church says that something about men being head over their wives. I'm a sort of Western man. I'll take that Christianity. That's how it should be. And so because now, I can't tell you the last time I heard a sermon in church about marriage, or even definitely not those passages. It's just people find it awkward. I mean, we worry about homosexuality, transgender. It feels like talking about marriage and sex. Let's just not go to any of those. Thank you very much. And if you're in a lectionary church, the lectionary completely dodges those passages. So you have a very good excuse to not do them on a Sunday. But yeah, as you were saying, like these passages get weaponized, but also there's not good teaching. And I think preachers and leaders feel anxious about not wanting to get it wrong and not wanting to almost, it feels a bit political, some of these topics, and they don't want to split a church or they don't want to be unpopular. But again, are there resources, are there tools, are there ways forward to actually address these passages in church in a way that's healthy?
Oh, 100%. And it's something that we're so passionate about. We support survivors, but we train churches too. And we have a resource called the Church Guide to Ending Domestic Abuse. And there's a whole load in there about domestic abuse, but at the back is a section on theology and how do we interpret these scriptures? What do they say? How can they be misused? But where is the good news in them, actually, for those who've been harmed? And I think it's really important. There's also another really brilliant book called The Bible Doesn't Tell Me So, written by Dr. Helen Painter, and she's outstanding, and she's got lots of work, because there are just some of these passages that have been taken and frankly twisted. So one of the ones that, again, because we do a fair amount of research, and we've asked, what are the passages that were used, or that even if they weren't explicitly used, you felt meant you had to stay where you were, or that were actually used to tell you had to stay where you were. And top of the bill every single time is wives, submit to your husbands. Ephesians 5. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Because if you do that, that's what you do. And in fact, I had a friend who went to a wedding, and I'm going to name absolutely zero names at this point. She's listening, she'll know who she is. But she went to a wedding, and some of her family walked out because the sermon at the wedding was so explicit about wives submitting to their husbands. Even if he's wrong, even if you know he's wrong, you submit to your husband because that's your job. I mean, that is frightening. And in fact, one of my friends, like a friend of them, was a policeman who came out and went, well, that was literally licensed to abuse your wife. And, and you just think you've got to be really careful. I am absolutely confident that is not what God intended when that went in the Bible. Even just as confident it's not what Paul intended. And it's a taking and twisting of a scripture. And here's the thing, the Bible does say, wives, submit to your husbands, but it's part of something that comes before, which says, submit to one another. Wives, to your husbands as to the Lord. In fact, the Bible, the original, doesn't even say submit to your husband. There's no verb. It just says what to your husband as to the Lord. There's no verb. So it's totally dependent on the sentence before, or there's clause before even, which is submit to one another. But that bit gets cut off. In fact, in certain translations of the Bible, there's literally a paragraph break, a new header, none of which is in the original. It's all designed to help us, but it's taken and twisted so that you don't realize it's tied together, and then it's much easier for it to become a charter for abuse.
So, come back to this idea of submit. That's not a word I submit an application. It feels like, to me, filling in a form, but when we talk about submitting to each other, it's just not a word that we use in modern language, but it definitely feels like surrender. It definitely has it's a power word in the way I would associate it. So I fully understand, submit yourself to the Lord, like God loves us, knows us, he is more powerful than us, and we trust him and we surrender to him. I can understand sort of submitting to each other in that sense of I almost think that if you're doing it mutually, it has to be cooperation. It has to be.
Yeah.
But yes, the way it's been separated out, it feels like you lose autonomy, or you lose decision making, or you lose preference, all of those things, which surely that's not what God's saying.
No, and here's the thing, it is a choice, because if you submit yourself, what that isn't is being coerced. Critically, what that isn't is being controlled. It's not being dominated. Submitting yourself it's almost like a reflexive verb. If you remember when you got taught French and Spanish back at school, it's things you do to yourself. I brush my teeth. I do these things to myself. I don't have them done to me. I choose it and I do it myself. And I think that's a really important inflection to notice as well, is this isn't about men or husbands dominate your wives. That isn't what it is at all. It's submit. And because it's come straight from submitting to one another, it is a totally different beast. And Paul says, submit to one another, wives to your husbands. I know, but then he says, and husbands, you lay down your lives. So the two are like examples of how you submit to one another. And, but they get disconnected and taken out, and we just focus on these few words because they suit our cause. They help us to control women.
So that's the classic. What's the next problematic scripture that you would say gets used against women?
Well, in the context of domestic abuse, there's a whole bunch around being servant-hearted, forgiving, suffering like Jesus. There's a whole load that can get used to say, well, I know it's not very nice, but you just put up with it. But another one which actually really does get used against women in relationships like this is in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is talking to the Corinthian church, and he tells women and men, crucially, actually, to not withhold their bodies. And this gets used really horribly to say, well, actually, there's no such thing as marital rape. There's no such thing, because wives should never withhold their bodies. They should always be perfectly available and ready at any moment. And if not, well, then they're disobeying the Bible. And again, this all really hits the top of those scriptures that, the women in our network tell us have been used against them to make them do what they didn't want to do. And that's particularly horrible.
Yeah. And then in the midst of all of this, the emphasis within the church on the sanctity, the value of marriage, like you've made your vows before God, don't break them. And so obviously we know that divorce is heartbreaking. It's difficult. It's financially crippling for both parties, but often for the one who's leaving. Often if it's a domestic violence situation, the woman is literally leaving with the clothes on her back. It's not something people take lightly, but this pressure to stay in a relationship when it is difficult. Yeah, I think churches do want to uphold marriage. I think our culture has often said, people don't get married anymore. They kind of just move on when the relationship doesn't suit them. There is something about committing to one another through good times and bad times, rich or poor, or sickness and health. Just when it gets hard isn't when you leave. But that is totally different to somebody controlling and being violent to you. How do we help churches navigate this? Because they're trying to hold up two things. One, keep yourself safe, but there's not a lot of Bible passages, I think, that we get preached that say, women, look after yourself, keep yourself safe, make sure that you're with people who are looking out for you. I mean, maybe the Proverbs, but it's, be wise. But those don't get preached about marriage. Marriage is like stick with people, as you say, suffer.
Suffer like Jesus.
Yeah. Keep serving. I don't know. It feels like marriage in the Bible times maybe wasn't so equal. And now we're in a different demographic where almost the instructions don't make as much sense. I'm not saying that they don't make sense, but they hit differently.
They do hit differently. But I also think there is some stuff there, even in the Old Testament, that we don't always register or notice because people have chosen not to share it with us. Because even if you go back to something like Exodus and some of those Levitical laws and the laws that have come down through Moses, there's a passage that permits divorce, and this is for a woman, and because he says that a man must not deprive is this if he's married a second wife. So again, it's slightly culturally different, but he mustn't deprive the first one of her food, her clothing, and her marital rights. And if he doesn't provide her with these three things, she's to go free without any payment of money. So if a husband neglects his wife, if a husband doesn't take care of her, if he isn't kind, she's to be allowed to be set free. Now, that's in the Old Testament, let alone the New Testament. So that sits there as this. If he doesn't stay within we often talk about breaking the covenant or the promise of marriage. Well, I think that so often that covenant is broken long before anybody leaves. And it's not broken by the person who leaves. It's broken by the person who didn't keep the promise in the first place, the one who didn't love, honor, obey, the one who hurt, harmed, and frankly hated in the way that he treated. And I think that's really important to hold on to, that actually there are these Old Testament principles that if you don't honor that original marriage promise, well, then actually the other person's released from the promise. And I think that's an important thing to note. But actually, even some of the more conservative theologians, somebody like Wayne Grudem, who famously said that wives must submit no matter what, even when they're harmed, even when they're commanded to sin. But he's changed his perspective too, and he's taken a new look at some of the words that are in Corinthians and said, you know what, it says in such circumstances, and I think that this could be extended to abuse. So there's more and more understanding about actually when there is abuse, when somebody's being harmed, when they're not being, when they've had all their promises broken to them, then actually they can be released from that promise. And so I think then it boils down to us understanding, really choosing to understand what does domestic abuse look like, because actually most of us haven't got training in that and we don't really understand. And how do we tell the difference between somebody who's just seen some greener grass somewhere or just wants a quieter life or whatever it is? Like, how do we tell the difference? What does that actually look like so we can recognize and respond to domestic abuse well when it's in front of us?
And just statistically, from your experience of working with survivors, like how much of domestic abuse is violent, hitting people, that kind of thing, and how much of it is sort of the mental control? And I imagine there's a lot of overlap, but like abusive, controlling, that kind of thing. Again, that's harder for people to say, at this point I got knocked down or I had this bruise, whereas the other stuff is so much more mental. It's harder for people to name it. Is that more common, or is the physical abuse more common?
The emotional abuse is more common. Sitting at the heart of any domestic abuse is this idea of control. Like the fact that, I control you and I'm entitled to get what I want from you. I'm entitled to make you do what I want. I'm entitled to get that stuff. So that sits at the heart. And it will nearly always begin with a level of emotional control and psychological abuse, slowly convincing somebody that they're not, that the world isn't the way that they think it is. And it's phenomenally difficult. I'm trying to find my actual statistics for you. I'll find them in just a minute. Physical abuse is less so, because physical abuse is usually what starts to come in when nothing else works. So if I can't control you by making you feel bad about yourself if you don't do what I want, if I can't control you by convincing you that you're going mad, if I can't control you by using scriptures to tell you that you must do something, well, then it begins to escalate to, well, then I will physically threaten you and then I will physically hurt you. So there's this escalation of what that looks like, but it starts here. So in domestic abuse, I would say that emotional and psychological abuse are there almost all of the time, and physical violence less. But somebody doesn't have to hit you to control you. You only have to think they're going to. And sometimes, and I think all of us know this, we get scared of a lot more than just being hit. There's that somebody is able to punish us in many, many ways, which is what coercion is, coercive control. And we will do a lot to avoid that in our lives, to try and keep people happy, to try and make them nice again.
Yeah. Okay. So, but it feels like when we watch the news, there's lots of information about, violence, teenagers being subjected to pornography that includes loads of violence, that young girls expect violence as part of sex now. So there's this narrative that violence is on the up, and I'm not arguing with that. I think it's true. But at the same time, we're saying quite often in these relationships, it starts with power and control. The thing that worries me is that there's a lot of power and control in church. We need to check ourselves, check our theology. We need to really work hard. Are we pressuring people? Are we guilt tripping people into behaving a certain way? Because how can we say, well, don't treat your wife this way, if from the pulpit we're guilt tripping people into following Jesus in a particular way? And I think that's really hard, because I think some of us have grown up with the teaching of God's ways coming with a lot of guilt, shame, a bit of pressure.
Yeah.
And so
it's been modeled to us. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard to come up with a different way of teaching or leading. And especially if we're frustrated and we feel like people are not being discipled or not following God, you often lean on the stronger power tools, don't you, to get the outcome. And you're like, guys, this is going wrong. What are you doing? It's layers, isn't it? Like, obviously we can look at it and go, violence is wrong. We can look at it and say coercion is wrong. But most of us really like being in control.
We love it.
So like, where's that line between when am I being controlling? And as church leaders and as preachers, how do we empower people to understand, take decisions, have a relationship with God, have their own conscience, make those decisions themselves without it being us guilt tripping them or saying, God won't love you if you don't do this?
We have to be a bit more like Jesus. That's what we have to do. And I say that, and it's really blithe to say that, but as you're talking, there's two things and then there's a lot more things that always follow behind it that have come to mind. And the first one actually is Philippians 2, where Paul is writing to this church and he says, in your relationships, you should have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who didn't consider equality with God, which of course means all the power of the universe, something to be used to his own advantage. And instead, and it goes on to this bit that we're more familiar with, that is about, submitting, coming down as a baby, being born amongst humans and submitting himself to death on a cross. But actually that first bit's really key. Jesus didn't ever play the God card. He didn't ever say, do you not know who I am? He didn't ever, in fact, he went out of his way to not let people see the power that he had, because he knew that it would be really hard to resist. It would be really hard. If you knew that you were speaking to the God of the universe with all that cosmic power, you would do anything he said, and he hid it so that people had choice. And time again, Jesus gave people choice. What would you like me to do? Even though he knows that somebody's blind and it's probably their sight, but what do you want? He didn't ever force somebody. When that rich young man came and said, what do I need to do to be saved? And Jesus told him, and the guy went, oh, I don't think I'm ready for that. Jesus like, okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Up to you.
When he drew people in and he invited them and he said, come and follow me. And some of them did. And some of them didn't. And he didn't chase after the ones who didn't. And he didn't turn around and go, no, think that through again, because have you got any idea what I'm about to do? Like, he didn't do any of that. Do you not know I'm about to give up my life for you? How dare you? Like, he didn't do that. He invited people, he loved them, he told them the truth, and he let them make up their own mind. And I think that is so important a model that we miss, because we so appreciate all that Jesus has done, because we think it's wonderful, because we want the best for people. We lose that little bit of who Jesus was, which wasn't a little bit, it was everything. He never made anybody do anything. He just invited them in. And I think that's huge. And we're not designed to control people. That's not who we are. It's not who God is. I once got asked in another podcast, it was with a probably more conservative end of the spectrum church who were doing a podcast during lockdown. And I talked, and one of the pastors said, this has been really great, Bekah, but can you help us understand where the line is between good control of your wife and bad control of your wife? And I, nearly spat out my tea and all the rest of it. And I fluffed an answer, honestly, in the moment. And afterwards, like 10 minutes later, of course, I've got a fabulous answer. I thought, do you know what this is about? This is about we're not, because I said, I don't think we're meant to control people. But again, Paul, writing to another church, talked about the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, all the other ones. But it finishes with self-control. The only person we're ever meant to control is ourselves. We can lead other people. That's not the same as controlling. We can guide them. We can encourage them. We can speak truth to them. We can do all kinds of things, but we should never control them. That's never what we were created for. And it's not the fruit of the Holy Spirit.
So good. Thank you. So I'm just thinking, church leaders listening to this, preachers listening to this, thinking, we need to address this. My personality is like, if there's a big, scary subject, let's talk about it. Let's talk about domestic violence. Let's talk about control. Let's talk about marriages that go wrong. I was the one at church that got rolled out to do the sex talk because I could manage it without blushing through the whole thing. But there is an element of there will be some people who will find this really, really hard to talk about. But there will probably be some people in each church who could do this and could do it well. And I just think there's something about not dodging this, especially in today's climate where we've got all sorts of, Bekah, you were on our previous podcast about masculinity, where we were talking about, all sorts of toxic masculinity, all sorts of weird messaging that young boys are getting. If the church isn't saying anything, it's really problematic. And we do know that God does have good things to say. And we've talked about some of the passages that are hard, but there is plenty in the Bible of how we treat each other with love, with kindness, with care. And I think we do need to talk about these sticky passages so that people don't get the wrong ideas. So how can church leaders equip themselves? We've talked about some of your resources on Restored UK, but how can we get better at this and better at seeing and identifying sort of the beginnings or actual domestic violence going on around us, in our friends, in our communities, in our churches? We need training, equipping, language. Can you point us to the right things?
Yeah, do you know, because that's the thing, isn't it? Is everything's about choosing to get more informed. So, Restored, we run training online every term. In fact, we've just put on a second set of training for our level 1 training for this term. And so get yourself trained, go and find out a little bit more. Our level 2 training digs into a lot of theology. So if that is something that you feel a bit stuck on, you might well learn quite a lot there that you could help with. But there are so many books out there. I cannot recommend Helen Paynter's book enough for trying to deal with these passages in particular. But here's the other thing. It's that this doesn't always have to be a whole sermon on this stuff. It's about thinking through in our ordinary everyday stuff. I was really delighted a couple of years ago when a friend of mine who's a pastor in America texted me, "Won't you be so proud of me, Bekah, today?" And he'd been preaching on being servant-hearted. And he said, and I remembered to say, what this does not mean is being a doormat and letting people walk all over you. You know, what this does not mean is not having boundaries. And that's all he'd said. But I was like, exactly that. You have just called out, because otherwise we just don't always, you know, we mean one thing and people sit in the pews and they pick up something that we didn't intend them to. And we say one thing and they hear it and they go, oh, I must just always be kind and do what people want. I must be a yes girl. I must be a people pleaser. I must be a keep them happy boy, you know, like that's what they hear. And like, oh, that wasn't what I meant. Make sure they don't hear what you didn't mean. And I think, then that goes for so many things, but I do think that it's really important to at the very least think, how might somebody mishear this? What's the one message I don't want them to go away with? And say it, like just say, you know, I've said all of this and I'm just aware that people sitting here might have misunderstood. What I'm definitely not saying is this. And it just frees things up. And let's talk about relationships and how we treat one another. Restored, you know, I've done a really deep dive on understanding power and theology, because love of power sits at the bottom of domestic abuse. Like it just does. And so, but now whenever I read any story in the Bible or anything, I'm like, oh, there it is again. And I see it everywhere. I see it. I mean, I love reading the Gospels at the moment because I'm like, oh, Jesus is so good at this stuff. But again, unless you're looking for it, you miss so much. And so, but it's that, have your eye out, keep an eye out for where are the stories that help us see this? Where are the stories that show us how Jesus was so radically different to what we see in our culture? Where is Paul talking in a way that actually, we always just focus on this bit, but actually what he's saying underneath all of that is this radical, beautiful truth about how we're supposed to treat one another. And it's in there. You've just got to have your eyes up to see.
Yeah. Oh, it's really good. And I think there are points, like in a lectionary church, there are points where this can come out more obviously. I really love the readings on Christ the King, which is in November, but they are all really about power. They're about how we handle power and what is true leadership. And that is a great week to really address this. And of course, we're looking at Jesus as the perfect example, but it ties in, it's very close to White Ribbon Day, which is all about standing up against violence against women. So there's loads you can bring in that time of year. But as you say, you can drip it into pretty much any talk, any sermon. You don't have to mention domestic violence if you've got an intergenerational crowd and you're worried about what you're saying in front of children. Again, the principles of honoring people, consent, not controlling, all of that can be said in child-friendly language.
Yeah.
So I think it is all there. And I think it's also, if you're a church leader or a theologian, you may understand the cultural context. You may understand that we look at this through the lens of Jesus, but actually really explicitly giving people those tools and saying, we're going to read this Old Testament passage. Here's the context. This is what the culture was. And we're going to look at this through the lens of Jesus, who gives us the perfect example. You've then given people tools in their own Bible reading when they find another passage that they don't understand.
Yes, exactly.
They're like, oh, wait a minute, what's the cultural context and what does Jesus show me? And so I think sometimes we can get a bit too deep dive into a particular passage and not giving people the tools to do it themselves. We want them to keep reading the scripture themselves and learning from it.
We definitely do.
Can you tell people how to find out more about Restored? Where should they go? How do they get hold of you, Bekah?
So we are restored-uk.org. We're an online organisation predominantly. We work with local church, so that is local, but we're online. And honestly, and if you forget that, if you Google Christian domestic abuse, you will find us, which is not something most people want to Google. But that's how you find us. We're very well optimised for that.
And you have so many fantastic resources on your website, like the posters that go on the back of toilet doors to help people get help. Loads of simple things that people can download, Bible studies, all sorts of stuff. Loads of it's free. You guys are amazing. So I have really appreciated particularly how you talk to this specific subject in a UK context. It's really, really helpful. Sometimes you can get stuff and you can pick it up from other countries or things and you're like, that's good, but how does it really work here? And your stuff is beautifully encultured. It works. The graphics are great. So go and check out Bekah's work.
You.
And get on a training program with her. Like they're fantastic, as you said. Are they every quarter that you run them?
certainly every term, and often more frequent. And what we can do as well is just come and run it. If you want something for your whole church or for more people, we can run that specifically for you.
Yeah. So don't just outsource this to your safeguarding lead, although they should know about it too. But I think it's really, really key for leaders and key volunteers to know this, to know the language, to know what they're looking for. So it's not just over there, the safeguarding people handles it.
And actually, I will back that up, because when we did some research in 2021 with specifically the people who had told somebody in church about their domestic abuse, we're trying to get an understanding of what that looked like and what happened. The one piece of information that utterly surprised us was that the person they were most likely to tell was the senior leader, not their friend, not the small group leader, not the pastoral, not the safeguarding lead. It was the senior leader. And we thought, oh, they're not the ones who get trained because they delegate it, which we understand because they're busy. But actually, whilst they don't need to be the person who carries the weight of that for the rest of the journey, that they understand not just the nuts and bolts of what the law says, but they understand the challenges and the implications and the stuff is really, really, really important. So we're on an absolute mission to get senior leaders to do some training.
Yeah, because that first response, whether you feel heard, seen, is going to either open the door or shut the door to you getting help. It's so critical. Yes, church leaders, get involved, find out more. As we're saying, you don't have to carry the whole thing, but you might end up with somebody telling you this at the end of a church service or ringing you and telling you, and it's good to handle that well as we possibly can. Brilliant. Well, thank you, Bekah. The other thing to plug is Bekah's done a fantastic article. I'm going to try and wave it in front of the camera. Called Women in the Bible. It's a Discovering God resource, so it's jargon-free. That you don't have to have been in church for 10 years and know all the things. It's just subjects that people might ask questions about if they're new to faith. So we've got one on angels, and we've got one on what happens after death, those kind of questions. And this is a question that people ask, like, what about women in the Bible? Is the Bible sexist? And so this is a way of exploring that, raising some of those issues, and Bekah's done a fantastic job in bringing that all together. So that is in issue 142, which is our March-April 26 issue. So get a hold of that, or if you want to, you can go to our website and find it there. And I would just encourage you can do this with young people, you can do this with small groups, you could do this in an after-school thing. It's written really accessibly, so it's not quite as gritty as our podcast has been. So if you're feeling like, oh, this is a bit of a hot topic, this would be a resource that can help you open up those conversations. Thank you so much, Bekah, for your time. Really, really appreciate your wisdom on this.
Thank you.
Bekah has written an article on how churches can respond to domestic abuse, as well as the Discovering God resource about women in the Bible. You can find both of these on the Roots website. There'll be links in the show notes. Find all of Bekah's resources on domestic abuse and preaching on these tricky passages on the Restored UK website. Roots exists to help you lead a great church that's growing, relevant, engaging, authentic, and together. We provide weekly resources to support preaching, worship leading, intergenerational ministry, Bible study, outreach, and children's and youth sessions to over 11,000 subscribers. Our content follows the Revised Common Lectionaries pattern of reading through Scripture over 3 years, offering common worship variations for the Church of England when the readings differ. And as we've highlighted here, we write articles and signpost to other great resources to help you cover the whole breadth of Scripture and all those topics that don't fit into the lectionary. Head to rootsforchurches.com to take a free trial and explore our wealth of resource available for a very affordable annual subscription. You can explore a digital subscription or add on our stunning full-colour magazines that help you prepare and share offline. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share with leaders in your church and network, and leave us a review as that helps others find it. Together, we can grow.